Aesthetics of punk rock, specifically the politics of punk. We're here with professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota, Abe Brennan, musician, visual artist, and I'm Sean Morris from Metro State Philosophy Department. So we're going to talk a bit, and then we'll see what kind of conversation unfolds. So thanks for coming, and thanks for watching for those of you who may see it in the future.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna stand up. It's okay, just because it's more comfortable. Slide. So, let me give it a title. Politics of Fun, PC Hardcore, Selective Service in the Revolution Summer. So I'm going to try to basically say some intelligent things, semi-intelligent things about, like, the politics of punk, which is, for some of the reasons I'm going to talk about, very hard to do, like, to say anything sort of, like, pointed and serious about the politics of punk as a whole, right? We're going to try to do that. And also, one thing I want to point out is, even so, some of what I'm going to say is probably specific to a particular scene. If you know any terms of them, especially Revolution Summer, that I'm going to talk about, it's going to be mostly about the DC scene, because like the major scenes, that's the one I was closest to growing up in Richmond, Virginia, to my high school and college years. It's also obviously one I'm very interested in picking up on, because of course I was part of it. One thing that's probably evident to everybody here, and probably anybody watching the video, is that the history of punk is only just being written now, like in some academic sense. There's all of a sudden this explosion of once. But up until about even like 7 or 8 years ago, it was just like fun, popular biography in the way of like serious scholarship of its history or its philosophy or even what punk was. Just recently. So there's lots of open space here, and I'll probably say stupid things, and I'm probably inadvertently trying not to say things that might just be specific to DC, the DC scene. I'm gonna just try to say some intelligent things here. All right. So now, slide. All right. So this is reacting to it. It's a number of blog posts started me thinking about this. I read this paper by Jesse Prinz, who is a pretty famous philosopher in like academic professor circles in philosophy. He doesn't mostly work on punk or on aesthetics, but he wrote this paper called The Aesthetics of Punk. That I disagreed with deeply on almost every level. But part of that comes out of different scenes. He's almost a decade older than me. His older brother was very involved in the early New York punk scene, right? Even to far enough back, I might even call it proto-punk, right? Real punk yet, even though I'm not going to get too excited about where to draw that line or anything. So he's got a very different background he's pulling from, right? But he identified 3 characteristics that he thought were central to punk: irreverence, right? So his quote, "Punk aims to challenge prevailing social norms. The canonical facial expression of punk is the unilateral lip curl, the expression of contempt." That part I actually think is probably right, okay, to a certain extent. Here's where I start to disagree. Nihilism, common themes include decay, despair, suicide, and social collapse. Punks saw themselves as part of the black generation, with no purpose in life and diminishing opportunities. This is really where I'm going to disagree today and try to say some more positive things about, and I mean positive like good, I mean just positive like things that were part of politics in general. Third thing, which I also deeply disagree with at a certain level of amateur, is punk band often play in ways that imply a lack of proficiency with their instruments or lack of vocal training. Punk eschews ostentatious displays of talent that have become mainstays of 70s or on. A lot of punk bands that way. There's also a lot of punk bands out there who are good musicians, right? And even some of the ones that play in a particularly, now he does say things like imply or eschews ostentatious displays of talent, right? I mean, tons of the punk musicians in the DC scene, for example, went to a magnet art school and had like 12 years or 4 years of high school of like serious musical training, right? These were not amateurs, right? And I actually call my objections to 3, which I'm going to stop talking about after this, the myth of Sid Vicious. Because Sid Vicious, when he was sober, was a competent bass player. If you listen to some of these tapes, right? He took bass lessons from Lemmy, right? He took it seriously. I mean, would he have ever gotten on a top 10 bassists of all time list? No. But he was a competent bassist when he was sober. It's just, I don't know what we know of him in videos, especially from the American tour. He never was sober. Even Sid Vicious, who were like, "Oh, look, you can't play. Play." All right, yeah. All right, it's Prince's project, right? He then uses those 3 things to argue for 2 more claims regarding what punk has to offer, in particular to aesthetics, thinking about art more generally. The first is punk rock involves an explicit rejection of traditional aesthetic norms, illustrating the plasticity of taste, right? The taste is different between different groups, and there are no like objective facts about what's good taste. As a result, serious consideration of the genre requires a rejection of global objective norms of value or taste, right? There isn't anything like objective good taste. It differs from context to context, and punk shows this. And second, that punk rock demonstrates that art and identity are often thus a full understanding of at least some musical genres is impossible without an accompanying story about social identity formations, including fashion, politics, and lifestyle within the relevant subcultures. And this is actually one of the things I'm really interested in. Also hip hop to a certain extent, although I know more or less about it. Is it's not just music, right? It's part of it's a lifestyle. It's a part of who you are. It's much more than the music, right? You don't listen to punk, you are punk, right? I mean, that's and you don't say that about every area of music. So some of that. So next slide. So then I think there's a paradox, or at least a puzzle, right? If the political aspects of punk don't go beyond mere irreverence for mainstream politics and a nihilistic, nothing means anything worldview, then which is part of the first three claims, then this seems like a thin basis upon which to argue for the claim that punk contributes in a significant way to the social, political, and personal identities of practitioners and participants. Right? If all punk is politically, socially, is right, there's nihilism. There's no meaning. I don't care. There's nothing to it. Right? Then it's hard to explain how that makes a significant contribution to the person you are, right? To your identity. So it seems like these two claims of his are in conflict. There's also this other problem, which I think was just obvious to me, is the description of punk as fundamentally nihilistic doesn't match many, if not most punks, including my own, experience of the culture in general in no particular scene. Next slide. Yeah. So first, I'm going to really quickly just say a few things about 1973 politics. I call this the origins of punk, right? Mainly because I'm basically in love with Billy Idol. And the big six, right, who I think of as like the big bands from that era that everybody listened to, right? Pistol, Flash, The Band, Generation X, Buzzcocks, and Susie the Banshees. By the way, Sid Vicious' first band was a one gig run, I think, in Susie and the Banshees, their first show, I think, which they had no rehearsals for. They just got on stage and played. All right, and of course, nobody denies that the Clash was exceedingly political, right? And political rightly so, right? But if you think punk is characterized by nihilism, then that makes them some kind of exception. Right? But if you dig into this history, there's some really interesting stuff that feels political, it feels like more nihilist. Right? Maybe some of this you could just write off as like as irreverence, right? But first of all, there is the, in retrospect, unfortunate, but I think not badly intended in the way we might worry about it now, use of World War II German references in punk fashion. British punk in the late 70s was particularly notorious for this, although you find it in American punk in the 80s too. But they weren't actually espousing Nazism, right? Where they're rather trying to shock the non-punks, right? And a really nice example of this was Billy Idol had, he was Top of the Pops of one of the shows. You can look it up. This is actually videos of it. He spent weeks, once the show was booked for Generation X, looking for a black button-down Oxford shirt. Because after World War II, and still in the late 70s, you could not buy such shirts in Britain because everybody who was alive during World War II associated them with the Italian black shirts. Right? That was the cultural association. And he wanted to wear one not because he was endorsing fascist Mussolini, but he just wanted to shock older generations. Right? Wear a shirt that just was not worn for political reasons. Okay. So now I want to move to DC punk and look at some more details, some political stuff there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the summer of 1985 in detail a little bit. Prior to the summer of 1985, DC hardcore was characterized by the inward-looking personal and local politics most closely associated with Brett, Ian Mackay, and straight edge movement. And in an interview, Ian Mackay in particular pointed this out, and he contrasts what's going on in the DC scene to what's going on in the California scene broadly considered, especially surrounding Dave Dichter and MDC. Right? So he points this out. It's what it boils down to is that I chose to speak about one thing and Dave Dichter about another. When we were in San Francisco, we got into this whole multi-nat corporation thing and what is happening with U.S. policy in America, which I agree is a very fucked up thing. Everybody's okay with occasional left on. But also 4 blocks away or downstairs, there are 13-year-old kids shooting speed. While I may be ignoring what's happening in Latin America, it's sort of vice versa for NBC. I like to see it as two of us being kind of a full novel, filling in the whole picture. Right? So what Mackay is pointing out here is like the political sensibilities, first of all, are clearly there. This isn't nihilism. This is both groups going out and trying to do shit politically. Okay? But very, very different kinds of political motivations and political activity. And whereas, California scene at the time, especially NBC, were very concerned with international politics and protesting, things like that. Right, the DC scene up to 1985, summer 1985, were much more concerned with local stuff, right? Politics as it pertained to me or my neighbors, right? So if you read like histories or interviews about the Discord House, right, a lot of what went on politically with the Discord and socially with the Discord House were like food drives for their black neighbors, which, again, looking back at that, they often asked their black neighbors if they wanted food before showing up on their go around with food drives. There were some problematic features about how some of this stuff happened, but it was all very local. Right, it's this very progressive local political stuff, right? Whereas out in California, especially with Dave Dichter, it was very much like international shit going on. Okay, but then the Revolution Summer happened. The Revolution Summer was this social, political, and aesthetic movement that occurred within the DC punk scene in the summer of 1995. A number of things that are notable about it is aesthetically the music, the DC hardcore punk scene shifted to more aesthetically lyrical and emotive and melodic emo-core bands, right? Spring, Embrace, Beefeater, which I earlier. But it also, and this is what interests me more than the pure musical aesthetics and music purposes of this talk, is that the scene emphasized radical activism, including various forms of punk rock, guerrilla, and DIY protests, right? And these were often aimed at national or international things, as we'll see some examples of on a later slide. There's another thing that was going on in DC hardcore that led to all sorts of things later. Riot Girl is another thing that came out of later, but came out of the same like bottom bullet point. Is the Revolution Summer also actively was the beginning of a sort of conscious, purposeful rejection of a certain very toxic aspect of the DC hardcore scene. Very male, very straight, very white, and actually there are other, especially East Coast scenes that had the same problem at the same time. Very fucking. And then some of these aspects were, this is why you got Riot Girl fighting some of these same tendencies later on and other kind of movements. A lot of this hung on past 1985, unfortunately, right? So when I late 80s, when I started to get old enough to go to shows and shit, I was in fights more often than not. That's just what happened, right? That's kind of scene it was. I think Boston at the time was just as bad, if not by some accounts worse in some of these aspects. But if your girlfriend came to the show, you went to the pit, she stood in back and held your leathers or your bomber judging, right? That's how it was. And I think that actually ties in that last point, both with some of the some explanations of the political stuff, right? But also with explanations for why this big political shift happened in 1985. Next slide, House. Okay. So a little bit more history on the Revolution Summer. It's actually not particularly well documented. There's some stuff on Wikipedia, and there's one book that actually talks about it in some detail. I don't know the name of the book. Probably the reference list at the end of the slides. But legend has it, at least. Some of this may be anecdotal. It's the best I can find so far. Hopefully, like I talked about, the history. We'll finally start to write these serious histories, and we'll find, this is the legend at least. So the Revolution Summer began as a joke amongst employees at the Neighborhood Planning Council, who were also in the punk scene, about an uprising aimed at eliminating an unpopular supervisor. But it sort of took on a life of its own, and then Amy Pickering, who was an employee at the Neighborhood Planning Council, and soon after became the front woman of the fire department, sent out an anonymous Revolution Summer letter, many of them, to prominent members of the DC hardcore scene. There's more to it than this, but dear Veer, yes, it is now Revolution Summer. There still is an easy way out. Don't take it, forsake it to break up. To break it, don't give up 365 days a year. So notice the revolution bit, right? It's this political messages. And it started this kind of political slide. One of the particular things that it led to that was very influential in the DC scene was the formation of a Positive Force chapter in DC. So Positive Force the chapter was formed in Washington, D.C. in early 1985. Summer thing. It was a punk-oriented activist organization founded in Reno in 1984 and centering around the members of 7 Seconds. While dozens of positive force chapters were formed across the country in the mid-'80s and I think even into the early '90s. Supposedly, the DC chapter is the only one that sort of survived to the present and is still active. And by the way, next slide. So some of the things that were going on, they were part of the shift from this very like local personal politics to this very inward looking, very outward looking political scene in the second half of the 1980s in DC. It was Positive Force DC, right? And they organized a variety of events that fit with the new outward looking political aspect of the DC scene during and after the Summer Revolution, the Revolution Summer. So there were anti-apartheid punk percussion protests, so a flyer for that. 2 anti-Edwin Meese poster bombings, if you know that particular underling of Reagan's and how awful he was. No business as usual events marking the anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Concerts and compilation albums benefiting the War Censorship Fund, the American Civil Liberties Union, etc. It's very much a very distinct change in how the politics of the DC work. So what was the Revolution Summer reaction to? Well, I think in great part, right, it was a reaction to the toxic masculinity of the pre-1985 BCC. Right, it was an attempt to sort of change what was going on by changing the political direction. I think that the toxic masculinity of the DC scene was all tied up in this, and that's what I want to explain in the next couple slides. So here's this otherwise really positive review in the Washington Tribune of the DC scene in 1982, right? It's all this good stuff. Then it kind of ends with, the scene's extreme masculinity is disturbing and offers a stark contrast to other forms of New Wave, which in the past that's actually the other thing. Has given women far more variety roles than any previous form of popular music. And this is something that's kind of unique in terms of various kinds of alternative music scenes to at least punk scene, right? And I was there, trust me, it was bad. But it would be I was there in '82, shortly after, still bad. It would be too simplistic to equate these admittedly negative aspects of the scene merely to just meatheads, right? Yeah, there are plenty of meatheads. Right? There's more than that, I think. For better or worse, these problems of the DC hardcore scene were intimately tied to political issues. And these inward-looking, what happens to me, my politics. Next slide. So, here's where the Selective Service comes in, right? The draft. So here's the history of the Selective Service. In 1917 to 1920, Selective Service is introduced because of World War I. Most of these are going to make sense. From 1940 to 1947, Selective Service was reenacted. From 1948 to 1969, Selective Service was again reenacted. Right? The dates men were actually drafted, right? Actually, their numbers came up. Were only 17 to 18, 40 to 46, 50 to 53, 64 to 73. But everybody was, I mean, probably most people in this room have signed up for Selective Service. And interestingly, of men, I believe the years, I'm not right off the top of my head, of males in the United States, the only males that did not, because there's a big range of ages you have to sign up for. So it's not just like, it's not people born in those years. The only people alive, it could be alive in the United States who did not, or were not at least supposed to sign up for Selective Service. Plenty of people have not done it. I think the range is like, I know I have the months right, I might have the years off. It's like March 1957 to December 1958. If you were born in that range, you never had to sign up for Selective Service. Otherwise, if you're born anytime in the 20th century at least, and even very early in the 21st and you're male, you signed up for the draft. Or should have. Or, yeah, in some sense, legally, sure. Oh, back. Okay, so in 67, it was reenacted. And then in 1973, this magical thing happens. The Vietnam War ends, it's very unpopular, and the government comes and says, we are ending the draft, we are ending Selective Service, we are moving to an all-volunteer army. This was a big freaking deal. Then in 1980, Jimmy Carter, of all people, who probably did not actually want to do this, but was doing it knowing Reagan was rolling up on him, and that he needed to do things that made him look tough, right, in the face of like hawkish, Reagan being who he was. was part of that whole strategy, I think, and I don't think he did it out of kindness of his work, and I think pretty highly of these presidents, I think pretty highly part of it, as presidents go. Right? But our government came back and said to all the men in the country, they said, oh, yeah, remember that thing we said 7 years ago? Just kidding. Go hit your post office and sign up. Right? And this was huge in the punk community. All of the punk community. So actually, the lyrics I'm going to show you in a minute are from actually all California bands. Now, next slide. So here, for example, in 1980, like right after this happened, is when you get drafted by the dead Kennedys. I'm not going to say any of these. It will be happier. Are you believing the morning papers? War's coming back in style. There's generals here, advisors there, and the Russians nibbling everywhere. The chessboard's filling up with red. We make more profits. Economy's looking bad. Let's start another war when you get drafted. Fan fires of racist hatred. We want total war when you get drafted. Okay? The dead Kennedys were not alone. Also in 1980, the circle jerks paid vacation. Hope you're having fun. Where's your uniform? Where's your gun? Better rub up that sun lotion because you'll be fighting in the hot sun. It's not Vietnam. Just another oil company scam. Salute that flag for Uncle Sam. Get your money out. Place your bets. It's Afghanistan. Yeah. War. Let's move to 1981. Reagan's in. Wasted youth. Notice this one specifically mentions Reagan, who actually, by the way, geared it up and like got it even more rolling much more quickly and much wider range of ages immediately. Reagan's in. We're going for good. Fight and kill the best we could. No one cares if we die. Reinstate the draft and tell us lies. Fighting a war, no one wins. People die. Bodies burn. Reagan don't care. He won't fight. He'll try and send us all to fight. One thing that's very interesting about this song actually is it points the finger in the wrong place. Right? This was actually harder than reinstated the draft. Although, as I said, Reagan just added to it, made it much more extensive, and all of this. One more by one of my favorites of all time. I even like moving with hair metal, to be honest. I still like them. If I don't register, I have to pay. I refuse to go. There's no fucking way. The system's looking for a drastic change. Don't look at me. It's out of your range. In the World War III, where I stand in this small government, where I fit. Notice the explicit mention of registering, right? Selective service, right? So this was immediately on the mind of punk bands, and this is just easy. Right? This was like, right? I'll just looking up song notes for right? But tons and tons of songs that talk about this, right? So a big part of like male punk anger, and hence, and punk anger in general was because the bands were mostly male at the time. They were singing about this stuff a lot, right? And so this became a big political theme in early and mid 80s punk, right? But notice it was a political theme that only applied to men, right? So I think this was part of, I mean, at least directly, right? Women, of course, cared that men were getting drafted. The actual phenomenon was aimed at men. So I think that this is all tied up, right? Some of the masculinity, the politics, right? Notice this is an inward politics. It's still a politics of worrying about what happens to me. Punk guys worrying about what happens to punk guys who don't want to go and fight wars. Right? By the way, for people who are very different ages, I remember when I was in college in the 90s, right? And Desert Storm 1 started, right? We were terrified because they were talking this war could go on for years like Vietnam. We were literally terrified that we were going to be drafted, right? And then the war turned out to be very short, and we won very quickly. Oh yay! This is very Gen X, whatever. And the fear subsided because the war became very quickly, very clear we became a civil war in the Middle East. At least it's not a good thing, but at least I wasn't going to get drafted, right? But there was this whole I think that the masculinity in these male political, specifically male political issues, were very much at the forefront of punk in general in the first 5 years of the 80s, like from 80 until 85. Right? When then punk reacted, because I think that male focus also led to some of the toxically male aspects of the scene. Or at least that's what I think. So here's the moral. So prior to 85, the DC hardcore scene was preoccupied by local personal politics, and the reinstatement of selective service loomed large. Now it also loomed large, notice those are all California bands, in this sort of like California, more outward-looking scene that was centered around MDC and other bands. But it certainly loomed large in the DC scene. This, no doubt, partially explains the overwhelming masculine nature of the scene at the time, and the sort of toxically masculine nature of the scene at the time. Of course, it's an explanation. None of this says it's okay. Right? It's not an excuse. Doesn't make it okay. Just kind of explains where it came from. I think the Revolution Summer was not just a change in the kind, it was a change in the kind of politics, as well as the kind of using all sorts of things. But I think this is part of the story too, right? And continues to be part of the story when you get the aspects of the origins of Riot Girl that happened in the DCC, right? That a lot of it was a reaction to this masculine stuff that I think had to do with the politics of the early 80s. How one of the big issues was very male oriented. All right, so this reaction, okay, so yeah, now you go to that slide. What does all of this tell us? Well, while the politics of punk is far from universally nihilistic, it does seem to lack any uniformity that might allow us to identify a single positive thesis associated with punk. Right? I mean, if you look even just at the DC scene, the kind of themes that were prevalent before the 85, the first 5 years of and again, it's not that sure of a line. There are these dramatic differences. Kind of political things that were important to the punk scene in DC before 1985, very personal, very inward looking. Summer 1985 shifted them to more national, international stuff, less about what happens to me and my friends. So different punk scenes embrace very different political stances. I mean, pre-85, look at DC versus California, for the most part. Even the same punk scene, right, same location punk scene can embrace very different politics at different time. DC pre-85, DC post-85. Okay, side notes with the official slides, I haven't talked about Riot Girl. Now this racist punk for thing. Christian core, all sorts of other things, right? I mean, there isn't a political movement that doesn't have some sort of punk associated. Almost, I think. Because this is what how I think we can describe punk. It's a kind of negative politics, right? What makes something punk, at least the political aspects of it, is not that there are these views it has to ascribe to, right? But rather, there's a certain kind of past political approach and past political mindset that it actively rejects. I think there are two aspects to this. One is this rejection of the mainstream traditional values and dominant culture of suburban, probably white, straight, et cetera, middle class life. The idea that you were supposed to, which had happened in the 50s and 60s and early in the 70s, is especially white middle class people left the cities. The Great Migration, moved to the suburbs, right? Got their house with a garage and 2 cars and a chicken in the pot and all the stuff you were supposed to have. And this picture of what success was. So and the politics that went with that, which were relatively conservative. So that explains a lot of the left leanings of certain punk scenes. But a parallel rejection of the Enlightenment through free love and psychology style, rejection of one espoused by the previously dominant cultural movement. And by that I mean the hippies, the anti-war movement. They were like, because the boomers basically. These are two little cartoonish about it. These are two aspects of like boomer politics, boomer morality. Where we don't like either one of those. Sort of settled. We gave up our dresses and our drugs, moved out to the suburbs to get a job at the bank. Aspect of the boomers, but also their previously, but when we were hippies, we solved everything. We ended racism and sexism and war, and thank us, we fixed the world. You're welcome. Both of these were rejected by punk, and I think in many punks' minds that's how it went. But rejecting those leaves open all sorts of approaches for building a positive political framework about them. I think different scenes, different times, different locations, there are lots of positive views that you can build that are I think rejecting 1 and 2 is what's crucially, in a sense, at least this is my theory, makes at least politically speaking, makes punk punk. Right. Now, one more slide, and then we actually talk. But I have an interesting observation. I think punk and hip hop in this respect are almost the same. It's why they're different in the last slide here. First of all, it's worth noting they arrived at about the same time. History of punk and history of hip hop. So do they have something political in common? I think they do. I think one of the central themes politically of hip hop is again the rejection of these suburban, and of course this part becomes much more important, white values after the white flight, but also this rejection of the particular white boomers, right? If you go look at Woodstock, there were people of color there, but there weren't that many, right? Also politically involves a rejection of both, right? In particular, a particular picture of what counts as American success. Right? Suburban picture of the house and 2 cars and the garage and the big difference, I think, is that So it's a superficially similar rejection of the same dominant culture, previous countercultures. But it's in hip hop, it's from the perspective of those who do not have access to that culture in the first place. Right? Because it's often observed, right, that punk, even to a certain extent now, but especially back in like the late 70s, the British punk, the 80s, even the early 90s, this is mostly disaffected white kids. I'm not saying there aren't people of color in the punk scene, but it's at times has been disappointingly low, right? Because it's kids, and most of them are relatively middle class kids from the suburbs. Because the DC scene was just middle class. I mean, this was in Northern Virginia, right? These suburbs around DC. That's where all this happened, right? And so these are white kids who have access to that dream. They can have, they can grow up and go to college and get the bank job and have the house with the garage and the car and the chicken in the pot, right? They can have that if they want it, right? But they decide they don't want it and build something separate, a different story of what counts as successful politically and in other ways, right? Whereas hip hop kind of has the same rejection of that picture and a sort of similar, different in many important ways, but similar building of their own political, social, aesthetic, fashion, all these different bits of their own, of this very different scene, right? They're rejecting the same kind of picture, but they're rejecting it from the perspective of people who don't have access to it in the first place, or they don't have the same access. Hip hop came out in the inner city. These were kids who were not, by any means, guaranteed they were going to college and could get the bank job in the first place. And media was selling them that same story of success that the white kids were being sold, right? But they knew they didn't have access to it, right? The white kids could have and rejected something they could get. Black kids rejected something they couldn't get, right? And built a different sort of story about what it was to be successful. So I think that's an interesting thing that punk and hip hop have in common. So I think that's the end. That's probably just reference. Yep, references after that. Probably good day. By the way, Billy Idol. If you want to know about the British punk scene in the 70s, please go buy Billy Idol. A lot of it has to do with him going to New York and his pop career later. But like the chapters on like the 70s in Britain and Generation X, it's a really different take than you get from like the live biography and some of these other things. And there's some really neat stuff in there. One thing that's really interesting is one of the bars they would hang out at after shows was the lesbian bar, because that was the only place they could go where they wouldn't get harassed. Basically, the lesbians wanted, the lesbians let them on. It was just like a big bar full of misfits. It was all great. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, I'm kind of done ranting, so we can like just now talk and yeah.
Well, thanks very much. So we are here and open for questions, conversations. Abe, I don't know if you have anything in particular. I don't want to put pressure on you either, but just being you've got kind of a West Coast beginnings and things. I don't know if you have anything you want to start us off with, or other people. I don't want to put the pressure on.
Why me?
Doesn't have to be
Because you're on fire.
Yeah, no kidding. No, this is interesting. I wasn't given, I knew a little bit about what you were going to cover, just from a little internet sleuthing and stuff. And I find it's always interesting when they're coming from an East Coast perspective versus my West Coast perspective. And, when I was looking at organizing in my mind, at least when it comes to American punk rock, a lot of it's really technically post-punk, if you want to get academic about it, but I always do it by labels,
Yeah.
So you had Discord, which had the DC scene, and for a long time they just did bands from around there, right?
I think they still
And that was it.
yeah.
I think there's a couple now from elsewhere, but
Rare
like for a while
exceptions, yeah.
it was like militant, like we're only documenting the scene around here. And then you have like SST, which is my personal favorite, and which like that's what I cut my teeth on, those bands, Black Flag, Minutemen, Scooby-Doo, Meat Puppets, bands like that. And then you have, of course, Alternative Tentacles up in the Bay Area. And then the other one that I was really into when I first got into punk rock was Touch and Go out of Chicago. Which, that was more post-punk stuff, but they had like Detroit's and Jesus Lizard, a bunch of really cool bands. But it's interesting because I guess SST was considered a punk rock label, but none of their bands sounded the same.
Yeah.
So it was a very diverse thing, but they all were really good for one thing, going against the amateurism idea. Like certainly there were some punk bands that embraced that,
Yeah.
and it was a nice leveling, democratization of like, hey, you don't have to be Eddie Van Halen to join a punk band.
Yeah.
Which is cool. But like all of my favorite bands were like they could play. The Dead Kennedys could play. Black Flag could play.
Yeah.
Meat Puppets, Husker Du, all these bands, like they may have started sloppy a little bit in the beginning, but even then you could tell something was going on. Yeah, and then as far as the politics goes, it was a mixed bag, right? You had like a lot of like with Black Flag. I mean, they there was a lot of nihilism, it seemed like, or at least a lot of anger. And I mean, they were anti-cop for sure. But I don't know if it went very far beyond that. And then you look at the Bay Area scene, and that was like explicitly political. So I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm still chewing on your thesis and the implications of it.
Can I follow up on a couple
Yeah,
things
please.
real quick, and then one thing I like the idea of it wasn't until I started writing these originally. Probably ran across some blog posts to cover some of this that I did it. The philosophy of art blog is aesthetics for verbs, which is where these ideas sort of got their first outing in a sort of simpler idea. And that's also where I write about the myths of Sid Vicious, and the amateurism stuff. One of the things I wanted to say is I have another really interesting thing about today is just this morning, a friend of mine on Facebook, who's also a philosophy professor, who is interested in punk but doesn't know that much about it, reposted this meme that's been floating around, which basically has this like most punk to least punk scale, and then it's philosophers. And apparently one of their friends, who isn't a philosopher, wanted her to ask all her philosophy professor friends, who, or at least the ones who might have something to say about it, to like say how accurate all these things were.
So Bertrand Russell is up at the top.
Oh well, I mean, we had a conversation earlier about Bertrand Russell, so I've been in this Facebook conversation off and on all day, and one of the things we were talking about the amateurism stuff, and you're exactly right. I mean, there's virtuoso musicians. One that was mentioned in this capacity, in particular, Bad Brains, right? For other reasons, but not the virtuosity of the music.
One of the best bands I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Top 5.
And but there was also this. There was this veneer of amateurism, right? This simple. It could be their songs are structured very simply. They're not hard to pick up a guitar and play something that sounds roughly like the song, right? And that did. I mean, one of the things that really did, and I think especially by the late '80s and '90s, this was very much on purpose. Is sort of an anti-gatekeeping thing. It was like, it really was, as you were saying, like kept the bar low. So anybody, it might take you a year or two to sort of get your chops up, but anybody could like join a band, and within 3 months you could get gigs at your friend's house, if nothing else, right? And build your way up, even if you hadn't picked up a guitar until went to 3 months before you get to shows. It was sort of that whole DIY, learn as you go sort of thing, and it really opened up that. And I think that was really important. The other thing is in terms of because both of my blog posts in here, I was sort of thinking about the scenes on different aspects of punks in terms of locations, and this just kind of came natural to me because we talk about the DC scene, and especially if the politics might be better trackable by labels than by cities. That's a really interesting thought. I mean, they're complicating factors, right? So there are two things with regard to scenes by labels that worry me, but I think are complicating factors. One is if you want to talk to someone about British punk in this respect, there really isn't.
Right.
I mean, a label scene, certainly not back in the '70s, and they're not like here. Never really the scene, these independent labels, becoming a big deal. Never quite happened the same way in Britain. The other thing is what to do with sub punks, right?
That's post-punk.
I think look, Bleach is a punk. Bleach is a punk album.
I mean, it's got the attitude.
I think we've been conned. I think grunge is a made up label for punk bands that they use to sell Seattle punk bands.
I mean, I'll give you this. I think the Fluid is a punk band.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's sub pop.
Yeah, but there's plenty of stuff. I mean, Reverend Horton is much as I love him, Reverend Horton, he is not punk. Right? He was on Sub Pop as well. So, but yeah, I mean, also you got to worry about what counts as a punk label.
Well, it's also what are they trying to do, because Sub Pop was definitely trying to distance themselves.
Yeah,
They were trying to create their own.
They're their own thing.
They did.
Kind of
Successfully.
capitalize on it.
And that's
I think before they did all that, Seattle would be a punk scene. I have arguments with people about whether L7 is a punk band or a grunge band. I think L7, none of the others.
yeah. I hate the term grunge.
Yeah, it's a horrible
I
term.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
The term at least definitely was made up by record executives, I think, or at least popularized in terms of to sell this to the crowd, to the general suburban public who wanted to watch MTV and wouldn't have watched punk bands.
It's funny you say that, because that's where I cut my teeth. Was like mid '80s through the mid '90s in Tacoma and Seattle,
Okay.
mostly in Tacoma. Like the main band I was in back then was actually from Gig Harbor, which was a little suburban town across the Narrows Bridge from Tacoma. But yeah, and it was interesting before Nirvana achieved superstardom and before Soundgarden signed to a major label and stuff. I guess you're right. It was more like it was more alternative before that
Yeah.
had a bad
Yeah.
bad taste.
Soundgarden-
Underground. Underground. No, they're not. They're
I mean, they're a weird alternative,
Hybrid.
strange metal band. Maybe hybrids.
They're weird.
Which maybe makes them fun, right?
And Pearl
Yeah.
Jam is just a hippie jam band.
Yeah, I didn't even count them in that same. And that's. I mean, they were, because some of the members overlapped in other bands and stuff like that. But aesthetically,
There's something very different.
Yeah.
Which also shows why like the public, people who won't go like buy Pearl Jam, they think that grunge is this unified thing rather than just a label to make all these bands from Seattle and Olympia and other places fit together.
Yeah, it's weird, because if you take like a band like Alice in Chains, which got lumped in with that, that's more glam rock.
Yeah.
Like that's not.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna count, if you're count, I mean, just them, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam. There's nothing those three bands have in common.
Yeah.
But all three of them have.
Right. All of them get
All.
thrown into that bucket.
One last thing I wanted to mention, some of the funnest and also most fruitless, this connects to something you said, conversations I have sometimes, especially with my philosophy professors, we're big on like distinctions and definitions and drawing lines between things, right? These are X and these are this. That's sort of how the discipline goes. And if there are lots of cases where you shouldn't do this, and we know that. But you try to do that until you figure out you can't do it. Right? And so arguments about like aesthetic, what makes a piece of music, right? Best I've ever been able to come up with, I'm serious, and these have been long conversations, is if you've got a decent number of pick slides, a good bit of hi-hat, those are decently reliable signs it might be punk. And if the lead guitarist is playing an SG of some sort, that's bonus points.
It's funny, like
That's the best you can do to and that's why it's clearly not just a musical scene, right?
No.
Because there's nothing that's going to encompass everything.
Well, it
everything
depends on what you mean by that, because a lot of people punk was like, it was fashion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like they had mohawks and they looked punk or whatever.
Yeah.
But you had like, I'll go back to SST. Like you had between Black Flag, Goose Voodoo, the Meat Puppets, and the Minutemen. All four of those bands are radically different.
Yeah.
They all, to me, are at least embody a punk
Yeah, I would think
attitude.
most people would take all those to be like clear cases of punk bands.
But I mean, many punks hated the Minutemen at the time. You know what I mean? They hated the Meat Puppets. They did, some of them didn't like Goose Voodoo. So it just, I don't know. It's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
I guess, but to me, it's more of an attitude. That's
Yeah,
what
well, I think it's kind of like hip hop, right? It's a number of different things, and the music is just one of them, right? So there's certain things in the music that might, but if enough of those things are there, then it's punk, right?
Sure.
It's like you've got music, you've got fashion, you've got politics, you've got scene, you've got just like hip hop has like breakdancing and DJing and rapping and fashion, and a couple other things are all part of what hip hop is. And it's hip hop if it's got enough of those things, right? I think things are punk if they've got enough of those things, but it's flexible enough that like the music can sound like almost anything and still be punk as long as it's connected to some of the other things.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I mean, the Minutemen were, they were political. They were really political. So in that sense, and they had radical politics, radical left-wing politics, socialist politics. So in that sense, they were certainly rejecting the mainstream. Then the sound was, they were getting spit on.
Yeah.
And they were opening for Black Flag and stuff. I don't know.
And not in the good way.
No, not in the good way. Not at all.
Well, I guess was the spitting thing, like the good spitting in the punk scene, was that mostly Britain, or was that in?
I think it was, Britain or Europe. I would contend that there is a good spit.
Well, no, it was meant to be a compliment, right?
Yeah.
In certain scenes, but I think
I just remember there was a,
Europe.
I don't know, Henry Rollins had a spoken word bit where he was talking about some guy that was spitting on him. He just kept waiting until he got close to the stage, and as soon as he got close to the stage, and the guy was like looking at him like, "What?" I was complimenting
I
you.
remember that too.
Yeah.
Because I remember that one. Yeah, that's what comes to mind. I think maybe that story happened in your on a tour. Right?
Yeah.
That's maybe what I'm remembering, and that's why I was connecting.
Yeah, questions and comments and things. So
Yeah, Abe Brennan, I was wondering, in your experience, could you give us anecdotes about how politics might have been involved in starting or joining the many bands you've been a part of?
I guess, like for me, I was a bit of a misfit in high school. Didn't really fit in, so that was one thing that drew me to punk rock. Because it seemed like, at least on a certain level, it was for misfits. And then the other part of it was I naturally just kind of have a anti-authoritarian streak, I guess, and a left-leaning bent. And so when I started hearing the lyrics, especially like Dead Kennedys, and then just the anger and just rejection of everything by Black Flag, that spoke to me. And then, as I was getting closer to graduate from high school and looking at like, okay, now what do I do? I don't have the money to go to college, and working sucks. So I think I had the idea right that capitalism is an exploitative system and it sucks because you're just going to get into the grind and get ground down. But I was immature about it, more along the lines of I shouldn't have to work because I want to party, that kind of thing. But so I think I had the analysis right and the impetus wrong, if that makes any sense. So those are some of the things that got me in the first place.
anyone else?
Yeah, thank you for sharing time and your expertise. I'd be interested to hear your take on, like, I know you focus specifically on the DC scene, but sort of like, I don't know what you would call like inner subcultural exchange of like touring bands and how different scenes affected them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say about that, right? But I mean, there's definitely because bands moved. I mean, Henry Rollins was originally part of the DC scene early on, as a famous example. Also, just tours, and people tended to crash at each other's houses. And unfortunately, I mean, of like stories I know, either not personally, but like from the literature, I can't off the top of my head think of any like particularly positive ones, except maybe a little bit about to share a very negative one, where various political aspects. It's actually something I hinted at earlier before, and it's sort of the dark side of bad brains. They're and some of them have since like rescinded these views and say we were young, we were idiotic, we weren't critical. We got very quickly, very deeply into Rastafarianism. This was a traditional form of Rastafarianism, but they were very anti. Very famous run-in with Big Boys, and actually Victor was there and got involved in that as well. Some accounts of the story, and they were very homophobic and very outwardly spoke, and like wrote a diatribe that they put in an envelope instead of paying for their pot. They gave to Big Boys, and also they had a run-in with Oscar Lee, and scribbled with markers on the house. They stayed at the not at Mold's house. The others, I'm going to know the name again. But, they stayed at the yes, it was, yes, and it was his parents' house. And scribbled on the walls of his parents' house a bunch of like F-word things as they left. I mean, just some bad stuff. And the big boys were like sort of an early proto like queer formation, right? I mean, sort of the origins of this in Texas of all places. And that was one of the cases where there was like interaction of very negative sort. Right? I think definitely some of them very sincerely, some of the people in Bad Brains later like apologized and said, look, we did awful stuff, we were ignorant, we didn't know what was going on, we were kids, sucked into this particular view and not being critical enough. But other members of the band were not actually still defend these views.
I mean, I guess one positive thing you could say is in the in the early '80s, there was no underground music scene to speak of, right? So those uh, those pioneer bands, especially like Black Flag, hammered out tour circuits around the country, and a lot of bands started using those. And I know when I first started touring in late '80s, early '90s, like we were fortunate to go out with some awesome bands, and we played a lot of the famous clubs that like the old DC, the old 930 Club, Whiskey, CBGB, stuff like that, that was still around and still still going at that point. And it was funny because a lot of them were still in not good parts of town, and they hadn't been gentrified yet. But that was interesting to see that circuit. So I guess a positive thing in that respect is they provided a blueprint for tons of people, and now getting in your van and going on tour is it's not revolutionary like it was, but it's still cool, and you can still do it.
One thing now things are coming to me, right? One thing I would emphasize that is super important is the zine scene, right? I think a lot of the political work got done in zines and the communication. If I'm remembering the history correctly, there's a couple books about this. Girls to the Front is one of them. Like a Riot Girl, right? Started in Olympia, Seattle, that area, and connected to the DC scene, and then some of the women involved there moved, and I think they, in fact, maybe they didn't move into the Discord house, but that's where their early meetings were and stuff like that. And all of that happened, like to connect with other women in the DC scene. All of that, if I'm remembering correctly, happened through zines, learning about other people and DC became this very early important scene for Riot Girl, but it was because the zines and other things, and probably touring as well, transferred these ideas from one Washington to the other. And I think the importance of zines, I think, in the political respect, especially, probably can't be understated. And I haven't done like tons of research on this, but
And figuring out bands. I mean,
yeah.
there
I
was
mean, there are
no
all sorts of
internet.
reasons.
There was like, if you didn't have a discerning local record shop, the only way you could find out about stuff was through zines or through talking to touring bands. But it's funny you say that because that was a thriving scene for a long time, and there were some big revolutionary periodicals, I guess you would call them, sorts. It's pretty cool. Fine.
I really liked your description of politics of that early punk period as a negative politics, in a place where plasticity can happen, which was another great word. And it makes sense because that period was like any sort of progressive politics had just bothered them, but there's really nowhere to go to get away from the mainstream politics. So it seems like punk that early part made space for that plasticity to happen, and then but because of that inward lurking nature of it, there was like a dialectical flip where against that pushed everything out of it with the MPC and the Revolution Summer. And so I'm thinking of like how we got from this dark period of progressive politics to now when there's kind of a resurgence in punk's role in maybe having being the kernel of them. Because it went from the MPC through I'm not even sure there was much of an anti-war movement in the 80s, but it did start up again in the 90s.
Yeah. While I was in college, I went to protest.
2000s, there was globalization protests, Occupy, and now here we are.
A resurgent labor movement, among other things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's one part of me that suspects it never went away, right? And it looks to many people like this up and down because it's like you're seen, and then you get old enough and you get tired, and then it's like you don't see it because you don't have any connection to it, and then suddenly it's going again because it's like your kids generate. It might not be your kids, but Like your kids,
No, it's
your
my
friends'
kids.
kids. Okay, yeah, and they're suddenly involved in these things, and maybe it's just those are the ones we see, right? That's a sociological possibility, right? Because I mean, they were clearly the '80s was, even though, like I said, it was like this locally oriented thing in the first half, and then outwardly. By the time I was in college in the '90s, I was, because when I was hanging out, seeing a Vale and going to Richmond shows, and when I could in high school, getting up to DC, not very often, doing that more in college. But I was also just listening to like the Misfits and just bands that were the Butthole Surfers. I mean, just stuff that was just silly, right?
Touch and go.
Yeah,
Mainstay on
Yeah.
touch and go.
Yeah, I love TSOL, right? But there was also, I mean, they had Code Blue, which was a naughty song, right? That song. And that song was just ridiculous to make shock value, which is a high school kid really funny, right? And so, but by the time I was in college, it was like this whole different thing going on. There was a lot of Middle East involvement, anti-nuclear stuff, right? And the whole like swing of that.
Central America.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah. Again, right? Because that was big in the early, like early '80s. So I think it's just the issues change, maybe. Maybe it's just when we see some of them and we don't see others, right? My really snarky answer was just going to be that Gen X got tired, and so it stopped for a while, but then the millennials got old enough, so, or the Gen Z kids got old enough. They started doing it for us. And we said whatever. I mean, that's one of the things is the history. Really, like I said at the very beginning of this, I'm not sure if you heard that. Just getting the history, right? I mean, there are all sorts of really politically and aesthetically important things where you can buy hundreds of books with scholars like writing the history and doing theory. I think I bought almost every serious like monograph written about punk, and it would not fill more than one and a half of them films, like academic stuff or serious stuff. Not counting like the fun biographies. Those are important too to get the anecdotes. I mean, that's all part of it. But like the sort of serious academic history and analysis and all that, it might not even be one of those shelves. Right? It's just not much out there yet. So part of it is I think like the historians need to keep doing the work, and it's surprising how little serious there is. But it's also right now exploding. Oxford University Press and things like this are suddenly publishing books on punk, right? So we're not just getting to read people's biographies, but some serious stuff.
that must mean we're really old.
There's that too, yeah. Yeah. Part of my Facebook discussions, this is just sort of cute, is I pointed out that if my story about this negative politics is right, the punk has to be part of this, either part of or growing out of this 2-part rejection of like boomer suburban values and their previous like boomer hippie values. Then punk had to be temporarily located. Just something couldn't be punk before the sort of 60s and 70s, right? Because just that's when those values those values had to be there and be there in full force, so you could actively reject them, right? And then I pointed out that made the philosophers list very silly because most of it was a non sequitur, because most of it was like historical philosophers like Kant and Aristotle and Wittgenstein, and they were just literally born too early on this particular way of accounting for punk to be punk. There was like a temporal limit.
I think Marx was pretty pumped when he was born.
Yeah, see, I mean, yeah, but according to the letter of my analysis, no, right? I agree. I think I agree with the spirit of what you're saying, but like the letter of the analysis, he wouldn't be, right?
Hey, where was Peter Singer on that list?
Oh, I don't even remember if he's on the list.
Oh, come on, that guy's a rabble rouser.
I'm just going to find out.
It might be a sign
Oh.
you need to rework your analysis.
But then both online and with Sean, I had these long discussions about where exactly the birth date was, right? Where is the birth date such that if you were born earlier than that, you couldn't be punk? Originally, I was saying it was like 55, right? I've now pushed back to at least 40 because I think it should at least be an open question whether Vivian Westwood is punk. All right, you might disagree, you might agree, but I think it should be at least be an open question that we can like have a discussion about, not just something that the definition, any kind of definition or like analysis settles. And she was born in 41, right? So it's got to be at least 40 if that
I
discussion
mean, there's
even
plenty
makes
of
sense.
people who will contend that there's nothing punk after 90.
Yeah, that's true too.
I still think Bertrand Russell's got to be on that list. So he's born in 1872. or
Yeah.
something like
Midnight.
Did you see
that. Anyone?
Adam?
What's it? Oh,
Oh, Adam texted it
Oh,
the same
did he
thing
come
to you
across
earlier
it? I
today.
haven't looked at my phone. Yeah, so okay, so Adam was on this. So yeah, you should have been here instead of in LA.
Who's the guy that was like always looking for an honest man? Like
Diogenes is
yeah,
that? Yeah.
always
That's
looking
right.
for an honest
Image
Failing.
Goldman on that list. Just out of curiosity.
Chemical. Yeah.
I'm not getting it. I don't think I'm getting.
You got
I
it.
might have it, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, hold on. See if you can get a phone signal. I'm not getting a good phone signal.
I feel like she should be right at the fucking top.
Who was it?
Emma Goldman.
Goldman was on there because a bunch of people got confused because they're like these technical. There are two other Goldmans. One's like a technical philosopher of language, and one's like an epistemologist. And they were like, people in the comments were very confused by why one of the other Goldmans were on there, and that's the Goldman that actually they had in mind. But it just said Goldman.
Yeah. Okay. So,
I don't think she was either of those things you just said.
No, it was two other ones.
Oh,
Confusing.
gotcha.
And they were very confused how this person could even be on the list, much less be that high.
So actually, so you've got here philosophers ranked by their punk credentials. They're not punk. Punk is them is the kind of top category. And then you've got Diogenes, Marx, Emma Goldman.
Oh,
So
right.
there you go. And then we're getting into very punk, which seems to be Stammer, I don't know, Foucault, Wollstonecraft, Fanon, Wittgenstein, de Beauvoir, and then we're getting into just punk. I don't know, the lines are not drawn. These are blurry lines. Irigaray, Camus, Sartre, Christie, Dotson, Butler, Payne, Lau, what was it? Lau, I don't know. Sextus Empiricus, Arendt, Rousseau, punk-ish is gonna stop. You got Nietzsche, Buddha,
Okay.
Mill, Zizek,
Buddha's a punk.
Engels. Oh, Russell's only punk-ish. Yeah, I don't know.
Way.
Epicurus.
The list is wrong.
Yeah. We're gonna have
That's
to
just
rethink
comments.
But at least in the version I have, there's a whole
Yeah, it
discussion.
goes all-
Russell's one of the people that is discussed whether he's
Yeah.
up, he's too far down. If
You're
you
basically a cop as the N category. You've got Hobbes, Confucius, and Heidegger. Yeah, and I think also who's just slightly above that was Burke and Kant. So, okay, but anyhow, I'll send that along.
even though I think
So-
this clearly violates my date, my date theory based on the political injection of the boomer stuff. I mean, the existentialists have got it. I mean, and they were on there, like Camus and Beauvoir and people like that. I mean, if anybody gets a pass on the date thing and gets in just for the content of their views, I mean, they're pretty odd.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Questions, comments?
Diatribes?
So punk's usually associated with anarchism. At least the symbols of anarchism. Right? It's got the anarchist symbol.
I wouldn't say usually. I think usually was too strong, but they're definitely obviously anarcho-punk and huge anarchist punk scenes. And I think in popular culture, there's a lot of association there, not by the punks themselves, and that's probably the association in popular, like outsider, presentations of punk, like how it's in depicted in fictional movies, things like that. That connection is probably stronger than it actually is in the punk scene.
And that's all Sex Pistols.
Yeah, I mean well, I mean, unless it's a particular anarchist punk scene, right?
Right,
So that
right.
was big, very big.
Crass.
That was very big in Minneapolis for a while, before I was there. But I mean,
Yeah, it's just
those
moving
big
backwards. I thought
inner-
there was
Yeah, but anyway.
a through line.
so what was
I just thought there might have been a through line there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think popular culture, like outside the punk scene, popular culture depicting it has really skewed that. And I also think there is really, and I mean, this was me, I would draw with a marker and a key, the symbol on my arm every day in high school. I didn't know what it meant, right? I was like, anarchy, chaos, we're gonna break everything down. But I mean, because it was associated with anarchy in the UK, which was, that is not a particularly politically sophisticated anthem, right? I mean, it's shock value anarchy, right? If it's anarchy at all, I mean, anybody who knows if they knew what they were singing about at the time. But there's a lot of it associated with these, especially with the Sex Pistols, and there's this particular image centered around, I think, that particular song. You're right. And a lot of that is just like young kids, a mature misunderstanding of what anarchy is. And, there's a Batman villain named Anarchy, and he turns out to be a teenager causing chaos in Gotham, and it's about the same level of like sophistication with understanding actual anarchism. So I think a lot of I think a lot of the general association is exactly kind of, is more like outsiders misunderstanding what's going on, or young punk kids not knowing what anarchy actually is, what actual genuine anarchism actually is.
Anyone else? Yes, please. Yeah.
First one is kind of a clarifying question. At the end you were talking about like hip hop and punk. But you categorize hip hop as superficial. Maybe I like spaced off or something. But what did you mean by that?
I did not mean to say superficial, if that's what I said.
Well, I think it was in the slides.
Oh, I think what you said was something about
Superficial similarities.
Oh,
Yeah,
superficial.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm saying that at a rough glance they look very similar, but the deep difference between the two scenes was the one had access to the thing they were rejecting, right? These values and politics and stuff. Whereas
That would be the white people.
that would just that would be the white people, and the people of color were rejecting it because they never had a chance at it anyway, right? So that's where hip hop came from. To say, you're trying to sell me, get me to commit and behave and sell me towards working towards this thing that I'm never going to get anyway.
Right.
So I'm going to reject that and have my own story about making it.
So it was similar in the sense that they were protesting something that was.
Yes,
really
they were both rejecting the same thing, but in some ways for very different reasons.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then
very different positions politically.
And then I guess I'm not too familiar with the punk scene. But what would you say has been the biggest impact when it comes to motivating society for change?
Like within the punk scene.
Just the punk scene. I mean, its value. I mean, obviously, other than aesthetic, pleasure of this is a genre of music that I like, since its purpose really is to, fight against or rage against the man. What would you say its biggest impact might have been or has been historically to progress society in a better way?
I mean, I think it's, for me anyway, it's more of an attitude of questioning. So that's kind of what it provoked in me was not taking things for granted. So in that sense, I think a skepticism, like a generalized skepticism that has kind of been imparted to a lot of people, to interrogate your surroundings and the structures and stuff like that. But as far as like some specific, I mean, I guess
I think that would have to be either whether however you carve this up, that would have to be like seen at a much more in like a time and a scene, right? Because I mean, look, there are Nazi punks out there. What they think the most, what aspect of punk has been best for promoting their view of a politically better world is going to be very different from what I say it is, right? I mean, because my politics are pretty far left.
but from like a materialist perspective, I mean, you talked about a little bit of the DC, of like, even if there were problematic food drives and stuff like that. I know that the San Francisco scene had a lot of mutual aid stuff happening, so that was actual material impact in their communities, that kind of thing. So I think there's been a lot of mutual aid stuff, that kind of communal banding together and providing things for people who don't have as much. Maybe that's it.
Like in your experience, what would say was the event that you found was more impactful that way, that maybe you were a part of?
Trying to think. I mean, I've played a bunch of benefit shows over the years, so probably one of those, but I can't well, I'll tell you one that is very personal to me. My best friend Trevor Lanigan, who I played in bands with forever, at a certain, he's gone now, but at a certain point he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and cancerous brain tumor, and he had to get operated on a couple different times, and they removed it, and he was able to live 18 years from that, so that was amazing. But when it first happened, we were friends with the band Lagwagon and had been on tour with them before and stuff. They're a Southern California, Santa Barbara, Middle California punk rock band, and big band. And when they found out, they came out and played a big show at the Ogden here in Denver, and gave Trevor all the money, which was amazing. They handed him like 15 grand or something like that to just to help him out in his recovery and whatnot. So like that's an anecdote. That's one instance, but that's one big thing that I saw happen personally that I thought was amazing. Yeah.
Two other things that just struck me. One is even though like different punk scenes and different groups or whatever have different views. One very continuously recurring theme in a lot of punk is a certain, and again, this is the skepticism of the question asking, but in particular, certain anti-capitalist views, right? Either the do-it-yourself scene, and connected to this is something that I think the political and social importance of, with regard to punk, is seriously undervalued. And someday I'd like to write a book if I continue to do this politics and punk stuff just on this, and it's punk houses, right? Punk houses have given us, right? And it's not the only thing that's given us this, but there's this whole co-living movement, right? The idea that people who aren't related to each other get together and share a living space and take turns cooking dinner for each other and sharing the bills and having like communal areas and like weekly meetings. And I used to teach a course on this. Like I would take 20 students, me and a couple other instructors, out to a farm in rural Minnesota, and we would live together on this like retreat farm and cook dinners for each other for 3 weeks. Right, they were on, and there was a town nearby, and we go grocery shopping and visit little local businesses up too. It was amazing. And the course was originally designed by somebody else who I got involved, and then they passed it down to me when they retired. And it was like this co-living movement, which was just catching on like 15 years ago when he started this course. Unfortunately, COVID killed this course, and which I'm really pissed about. But there's nothing I can do about it. We can't get it running off in the new living. But ironically, other groups have experimented with this sort of thing, right? Hippie communes, ironically, are another experiment of this. So it's like this is one aspect of punk culture where whether they intended to reject the countercultural movement that came before. Here's one spot where they didn't entirely. It's the punk house, and I think the punk house has given us this history of not always and not perfect by any means. If you read some of the little bit of history about punk houses that's not been written, where if you lived in one or even been a regular person around one. But this has given us a really viable model of like relatively inexpensive, successful co-living environments, right? A model that could be broadened, right, to really show a different way of living. Then each family gets your house and talks to your neighbors if you like them, but you build a big fence if you don't, and just stay in your little suburban cell. I think is a very different and a successful, and it's not unique to punk, but there's still a lot of punk houses, out there operating, and influential not just in their local punk scene, but then in the larger community. Discord House, Gilman House, I forget the name of it, the one that was in I just read a really good oral history of that one. I think that's really underappreciated, the political but social importance of that, and how that, and maybe it's not only underappreciated, but it's undermobilized in terms of talking about what that could be used for, like in terms of thinking about how we live our lives. And actually, it was the reason I got interested in this weird course taking students to the farms, because I, in my head, connected it with punk houses. And I was like, this is kind of the same. It's different. We're going to a farm, right? It's a hobby farm, right? It was really a Methodist retreat center that the instructors would go to 2 days ahead of time and take all the religious stuff along, which they were happy with. They loved the course, but we had to take all the crosses down. But it wasn't like farming. You let bedrooms, beds. And didn't have to go. Well, we did feed the chickens and had fresh eggs every morning. That was kind of cool. But, in my head, when I was first told about this course, I just connected to punk houses. Right, a whole bunch of people who might not have even known each other until they moved in, right? But just would move in together and somehow find a way to live together in a community. And that's what this course was about. And that wasn't what these instructors who were like 30 years older than me, the people who started the course, that's not what they had in mind at all, punk housing. But that's what I saw. Right? Was the
No, they were the hippies.
They were totally the hippies, yeah.
Yeah, it was like, did that get its root from like the hippie era or vice versa?
I think that it came from I think the co-living movement is a separate movement. This is just is actually much more historically connected to the boomers, countercultural movement, and like so it grew out of like more hippie style communes. But I think that's one interesting place where intended or not, right, certain aspects of those two countercultural movements actually are quite similar. The details might be different in how they ran their communities, but they're both, weird enough looking to anybody who lives in sort of standard suburban America. Suburbanites aren't going to see much difference between the two kinds of co-living.
And two thoughts to share to your question. One, co-living, big movement still happening right here in Denver. Queen City Cooperative, one of many. Bill, actually got laws changed in Denver about how many non-related people can live in the same house. For years it was like 4, you had to be married, your siblings, for your children, something like this. But now it's like 6 to 8 non-related people, something like that, can live together. So it's just interesting, the whole co-living movement born out of the culture, but just a different way of kind of flipping capitalism on its head and looking at like rent places, housing, especially today's market. So I just think that's really interesting. Queen City Cooperative would be the place to live. And then to answer your question more specifically, personally for me, what I got from getting into punk rock when I was youth, activism and protest. So when I was really getting into punk rock, I guess, high school, many of us did, 9/11 happened. So there was a lot of anti-9/11 protests in our the WTO protests in Seattle. So for me, it activated me. Like I always knew I was kind of very anti-authority that Abe explained earlier. That was a big draw for me initially. The energy, the loudness, the fast music drew me in musically, but it really activated me in a political way that I don't think I would have gotten into going to protests, protesting against Columbus Day here in Denver. We don't have Columbus Day here in Denver.
Yep.
Celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, right? And so that's what I got out of that scene. It's just the political activism in myself that got me involved in a way I don't think.
So mobilized you actually.
Definitely mobilized me.
I
A lot of other music at that time to me was very superficial. It was just about drinking and partying and that type of stuff. And it was the serious nature that the conversations that led to the impact on real world stuff that was a big draw.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially before the internet, right? So like when I was in high school and college, right, the late 80s, early 90s, like zines or just being in a scene and going to shows hooked you up with a network where you could learn about what politically was going on. You might be in the very city you live in, even smaller cities. You might just not have any other way to access or to know about it, right? Was other than the network and the scene, especially pre-internet. That was super important. The other little tidbit of trivia. So the older instructors who originally started this farm course that I do, they actually when they retired and they stepped away from the course, at least the main couple, they were looking into like finding a building to like do some big ambitious co-living sort of experiment because there's not much of it going on in Minneapolis. For one main reason that I'm going to mention, because it's not just maximum. This is weird trivia, so I just thought I'd share. It's not just maximum occupancy laws, right? Minneapolis has, I forget exactly what their like name is, but like Madam laws, where there are specific laws about the maximum number of unrelated women that can live in a single dwelling. I think it's 2. I think the law is still on the books. It's just a number of years ago, Minneapolis made it clear we are just never going to enforce this, right? And we're not stupid. I think technically, it's like one of some of these crazy ice cream eating on Sunday laws, and like we're not going to bother taking it off. It's obviously so stupid that would just draw more attention to it. But I think it's more than 2 in Minneapolis, that they can legally they can shut down anything that had 3 or more non-related women. And they eventually could